Hi, my name is William Bass. I'm presenting my thesis, The Effect of a 3/4 inch wedge on the kinematics and kinetics of the bodyweight squat in baseball and softball catchers. All right, so a big part of my introduction was orthopedic injury is definitely a part of sport. Uh, Purely anecdotally, the reason I chose the specific population is because all the baseball and softball catchers I've known over the course of my lifetime have all experienced some sort of patellofemoral pain syndrome, whether it be uh, lifetime or in throughout short spurts in their careers. Uh, so the bodyweight squat is actually a foundational movement. It's a movement that's utilized in strength and conditioning programs around the nation, probably around the world. uh, if performed correctly, can actually reduce knee pain and keep all joints that are associated with it healthy. Uh, so one thing that was really eye-opening to me was the decreased dorsiflexion is actually linked to decreased knee flexion in the bodyweight squat. It's also linked to patellofemoral pain syndrome. So, in turn, just decreased dorsiflexion has been shown to be linked to patellofemoral pain syndrome. Uh, so, Knee Savers is a product that's on the market that's basically a uh, foam cushion that sits on uh, the back of the shin guards, so on the back of the gastroc, and allows the catcher to squat down onto them, which creates a joint distraction and actually increases the compressive forces. So I do believe that those actually would probably be more harmful than helpful. Uh, so I do think that weightlifting shoes could be used for bullpen catchers. They do not increase dorsiflexion. Uh, However, they do increase shin angle, and shin angle is actually what allows uh, greater knee flexion. So with greater knee flexion comes greater lower limb activation of the in the bodyweight squat of all the lower limb muscle, uh, and it also allows for decreased hip flexion due to less forward trunk lean, and that's also been shown to decrease the shear forces put on the spine via the squat. So the shift in center of balance forward allows for more upright torso, uh, greater stability as well. That comes from the hardened soles and the widened base on weightlifting shoes. Oh my God. I apologize for that. Uh, so the purpose for this proposed research is to determine if the 3/4 inch wedge will actually increase dorsiflexion, or in this case, shin angle, uh, enough to change total knee flexion, total hip flexion, total force generation, and center masses and forces that act on those center mass changes during the body weight squat. The independent variable is just the addition of the 3/4 inch wedge, whereas the dependent variable is all the measurements we're going to take from uh, going through the study. All right, so 5 male and 3 female subjects participated. Uh, they were all Division II baseball and softball catchers, all active between the ages of I think, 19 and 23. They were all medically cleared by their athletic trainer to participate in sport and the study. Uh, Subjects, they filled out the informed consent, obviously, and then they were weighed and their height was measured upon arrival. Uh, I wanted to see how they would perform given like a game day routine as opposed to like giving them the same exact warm up that they would go through as if they were in like a weight room. So I wanted to see how they would actually move in the field of sport rather than how they would move in a weight room or a lab. Joint markers were actually they were placed on their shoes, the lateral malleolus, lateral knee, uh, the hip joint, and the inferior lumbar and lateral thoracic spine, or lateral lumbar and lateral thoracic spine. So we could actually clearly mark the joint angles. Okay, so they were allowed 10 prior, less than 10 practice repetitions squatting on the platform and force plate, simply because the platform and force plate were a little bit slippery. They needed to get used to that surface so nobody was injured. The order in which they completed it, that being the wedge or without the wedge, was randomized. I flipped the coin. Heads was they completed the wedge first with 5 repetitions per iteration. Uh, each subject placed their dominant leg on the force plate, and their non-dominant leg behind, off of the force plate onto the platform. As it was recorded, and the joint angles were taken from there using a GoPro at 1080p and 30 frames per second, all filmed in the sagittal view. Data is collected at a rate of every 0.005 seconds. So we amassed a mountain of data in that short amount of time. Okay, for the statistical part of this and the actual analysis, uh, the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test was used to determine if data was normally distributed. It was not. So we had to further analyze it using the SPSS package from IBM, using asymptotic significance two-tailed tests where P was set for significance less than or equal to 0.05. The joint angle data was analyzed using a Microsoft Excel with just a two-tailed t-test. The means being compared were the joint angles of the hip, knee, and ankle, the lateral, medial, and anterior, posterior center of pressures, along with downward force and the forces acting on those center of pressures, which is the f of x and the f of y, for both conditions. Okay, so the results between the 8 participants, the mean peak dorsiflexion without the wedge was not significantly lower than with the wedge, but it was really close to being significantly lower. And that is more so shin angle than it is dorsiflexion. That's probably a misnomer on my part. So knee flexion was significantly greater with the wedge than without, and the hip flexion was actually a little bit less with the wedge. So yeah, it is pretty concurrent with all of the other research that I looked over in writing the literature review, and that increase in dorsiflexion or the addition of a weightlifting shoe will actually increase knee flexion and possibly increase or stay the same with hip flexion. Okay, so every one of the means for the with wedge uh, iterations, they were all statistically significant. Uh, so the addition yielded a greater mean and lesser standard deviation in range in the vertical force. So there was there was a larger amount of force applied with the use of a wedge, and there was lesser standard deviation in range, which just signifies that the data was more. Uh, it just means that the data was more consistent. Sorry about that pause. Uh, let's see. For the lateral medial, uh, the wedge had a greater mean, which means that there was a greater deviation, which is not what I thought it was going to be. I'd actually assume that with the increased stability of the wedge, that the shifting side to side would actually be lessened. But all of the categories was actually higher, so it would lead me to believe that it was a little bit less stable, and it was actually there were more deviations in it. There's probably greater movement within that. Okay, so the anterior and posterior force, it was significantly larger with the addition of the wedge, and I believe that's just because the shift in center of pressure allows the knee to uh, track a little bit more forward, which in turn would shift the weight a tiny bit more towards the toes. Uh, the same thing with the center of pressures too. The lateral medial, there was a lesser mean of the width wedge, so that would lead me to believe that uh, there was actually a little bit more valgus, as it was actually negative. Uh, so for the anterior posterior, the addition of the wedge, it yielded a greater mean. So not only was the force greater, but the actual magnitude of the shift was greater as well. Okay, so increased dorsiflexion it experienced with the addition of the wedge is actually shin angle, as we discussed earlier. Uh, Shin angle is what allows knee displacement anteriorly during the squat, specifically towards the in range of motion of a squat. Uh, that shifting of the knee forward allows the hips to go forward more, which allows the center of pressure to uh, it allows the hips to come a little bit more forward, uh, and allows that torso to stay up a little bit more upright. Uh, and that's probably also what caused the increase in the vertical force. Uh, so the greater mean of f of y, which is the forward and backward or posterior anterior, larger averages because of what we were speaking of earlier with the actual shift. And I believe I am actually hitting my time right now. I hope you enjoyed this. Here is the works cited.